Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. In this section, we're going to be talking about Alfred Adler, who developed individual psychotherapy. Perhaps one of the easiest ways to think about the difference between Adler and Freud is with the quote, "We are pulled by the goal rather than pushed by the drive." Freud believed that biological impulses, such as sexual drive, actually drove us to behave in certain ways. In contrast, Adler did not believe that we had unconscious drives that motivated our behavior. Instead, he saw that we had goals and that we were goal-directed beings, and that when there were problems, it was because we were living mistaken goals. Adler didn't believe these goals came from nowhere. He, like Freud, believed that our childhood was very important in shaping who we were. Adler believed that these goals were shaped by our childhood, that in our childhood we started to think of who we were and who we should be and what kind of life we should lead. One of the other differences between Adler and Freud is that Adler took what we call a phenomenological approach. That is, he wanted to understand how people perceived their worlds. This was really a radical shift from Freud's perspective, which was not only was there an objective reality, but that in fact he, the expert, could interpret people's lives based on an understanding of an objective reality. In contrast, Adler really saw that people would construct their own worlds, and in order to understand and help the person, you had to really understand how they perceived their own world. And that's called the phenomenological viewpoint. Another difference was Adler's concept of social interest, which suggested that happiness was really related to the extent to which we were socially connected. And Freud really didn't take a look at how our actions were motivated by our desire to improve or live in society. Although Freud did have an interest in society, one of his major works was Totem and Taboo, which took his theory and applied it to cultures. He was really interested in the individual. Another difference is that Adler looked at birth order and sibling relationships in much more detail than Freud ever did. Adler saw the therapeutic relationship and the role of the therapist in a much different light than did Freud, whereas Freud saw the therapist as being a blank slate and the expert whose responsibility relied mostly around interpreting. Adler saw the therapist as being a teacher, helping the client understand mistaken goals, and really to encourage the client. He saw that the therapeutic relationship had to be a collaborative partnership in order for this to work. Some of the key concepts of Adlerian psychology are that the conscious, rather than the unconscious, is the center of personality. Adler's approach stressed the individual's positive capacities to live fully in society. Adler saw that personality was one single global thing as opposed to divided into id, ego, superego. That in order to understand the client, you had to understand it from their vantage point. And that finally, in keeping with his idea that we are goal-driven, the orientation is towards the future rather than the past. Adler stressed that life goals gave direction to human behavior, and that humans were motivated by social interest or a sense of belonging and having a significant place in society. He also saw that feelings of inferiority often served people as the wellspring of creativity, that they were a motivating force for people to strive for mastery, superiority, and perfection. So when we think of this phenomenological approach, we really understand that Adler attempted to view the world from the client's subjective frame of reference. Childhood experiences are not crucial, as they are in Freudian psychoanalysis, but that it's how we currently interpret our childhood events that is most important. We have behaviors that are not determined by unconscious instincts in our past, but rather by our goals. Now, this idea of social interest is really key in Adler's theory. In fact, many have suggested that this has been his most significant and distinctive concept. Social interest refers to an individual's attitude toward and awareness of being part of the human community. Mental health is measured by the degree to which we successfully share with others and are concerned with their welfare. And happiness and success are largely related to social connectedness. Now, Adler came up with this idea after serving as a doctor in a World War I hospital and seeing the atrocities that people inflicted upon other people, particularly children. And when he came back from the war, he really solidified this idea that we have to develop a social interest if we are to avoid inflicting such atrocities on others in the future. In keeping with this idea, Adler believed that there were specific universal life tasks. There was a social life task, which was building friendships. There was a love and a marriage life task, and this had to do with establishing intimacy. Another life task was occupational, and this was how we would contribute to society. We also have the responsibility of self-acceptance. That's getting along with ourselves. So it's not just that we have to get along with others, but we also have to be able to really accept ourselves. And this was a pretty unique idea during the early 20th century. And then finally, there's the idea of building and developing a spiritual dimension. Another major contribution of Adler is the influence of birth order on our life path. Adler suggested that the oldest child was the one that received the most attention, was oftentimes spoiled, and really took a leadership position. The second child, if it was second of two, oftentimes behaved as if in a race, oftentimes developed their personality in opposition to the first child. Now, it's important to realize that Adler himself was a second child. Some attribute his leaving, or getting kicked out, of Freud's Psychoanalytic Society in Vienna to his desire not to have to follow in the footsteps of a, quote, older brother. Now, the middle child often feels squeezed out. The youngest is babied, and an only child has difficulty sharing or cooperating with other children and spends most of their time learning how to deal with adults. During the therapeutic process, Adler believed it was important to challenge his clients' mistaken notions and faulty assumptions. And in order to do that, he had to work cooperatively with his clients to provide encouragement so that they could develop socially useful goals. He also recognized symptoms as attempted solutions. He also saw the idea of encouragement as being the most powerful method available for changing a person's beliefs. He saw that encouragement helped to build self-confidence and stimulate courage, and that through encouragement, you could help clients recognize that they had the power to choose and act differently. Now, some of Adler's basic therapeutic goals were to foster social interest, help clients overcome feelings of discouragement and inferiority, to change clients' lifestyles and faulty motivation, to develop a sense of equality with others, and to become a contributing member of society. Adler used different types of assessments in his therapeutic work. One of them was a lifestyle assessment, and these contained questions about one's family constellation, early recollections and dreams, and a summary of what the client's lifestyle was like. Family constellation focuses on social and psychological structures of family systems, birth order, individuals' perceptions of self, sibling characteristics, and parental relations. Now, lifestyle refers to core beliefs and assumptions through which the person organizes his or her reality and finds meaning in life events. This is a very different approach than we would consider to be traditionally medical model, in that it assumes a growth model and requires a sort of almost a biopsychosocial, spiritual, contextual understanding of who the client is and how his problems came to be. In this assessment, Adler would look and explore the client's private logic or concepts about himself, others, and his life that constitute his philosophy that has become his lifestyle. Clients' experiences are seen as discouraged, not mentally ill or emotionally disturbed. The relationship between the therapist and client is based on mutual respect. Client and therapist are both active parties in a relationship between equals. The therapist and client focus on examining the client's lifestyle And the therapist frequently interprets this lifestyle by demonstrating connection between the past, present, and future strivings. Some of the techniques that Adler would use include establish the proper therapeutic relationship, exploring the psychological dynamics operating in the client, encouraging the development of self-understanding. That specifically looks like gaining insight into the client's purpose, and also helping the client to make new choices. And Adler talked about this in terms of reorientation and re-education. Adler innovated a bunch of techniques that have been incorporated into treatments that we might not consider Adlerian. Take for consideration some of the following techniques. One technique was identifying mistakes that clients would make. For example, overgeneralizations, having false or impossible goals of security. He identified misperceptions of life and life's demands, and minimization or denial of one's worth, and identifying faulty values. These have been fully adopted into cognitive approaches to therapy. He also used classic questions such as, what would be different if you were to do whatever? One of the other things that Adler would do that other therapists such as Salvador Minuchin would later capitalize on were paradoxical intention, such as if somebody was having a difficult time falling asleep, then he would suggest that they would try and stay awake. Just really make sure that they did not go to sleep before a certain hour tonight. He also set tasks and required his clients to commit to specific things. He assigned homework, which is another staple of cognitive therapy. But all of this was surrounding this idea that when clients come in and they're having problems, it's because they are living mistaken goals. Some of the areas in which Adlerian therapy has been applied include education, parent education, marriage counseling, family counseling, and group work. In a lot of ways, Adler's concepts and ideas have been really integrated into the American education system. Some of this can be attributed to the fact that there were a number of years in Vienna where, prior to World War II, Adler was responsible for setting up mental health clinics in the 30 state schools, otherwise known as public schools, in Vienna. Some of the contributions of Adlerian therapy are to really bringing the psychoeducational focus of treatment into the fore, also for creating a present and future orientation, and also thinking about therapy as being brief or time-limited. Adler really developed the first treatment that was geared towards folks of lower socioeconomic status. And this is in direct contrast to what Freud was doing with his predominantly upper-class Viennese society clients. Another contribution is that Adler addressed social equality issues and the social embeddedness of humans long before multiculturalism became a central focus in the social work profession. Now, some of the limitations of Adlerian psychology are that some of the concepts are pretty vague and difficult to validate empirically. And this is due in part to Adler's decision to teach his individual psychology rather than to develop his theory. And a final limitation is that some have argued that Adler really oversimplifies complex human functioning. He sees individuals as unified wholes who live entirely goal-directed lives. And if you figure out their goal, then you figure out the person, and then you figure out the problem. But some have argued, and I think rightly so, that there are times and reasons why we have multiple goals. And some of those goals can be conflicting, but that they do not reflect a single unified person, that we have multiple parts, not necessarily in a Freudian way, but that we have multiple biographies, and in different situations those can become more or less important. So again, just to sum up, remember that for Adlerian therapy, the idea is that we are pulled by the goal rather than pushed by the drive. So I'm Jonathan Singer. Thanks for being with me today for this episode of the Social Workers Podcast. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, please feel free to email me at cooljazz flash.net. And to all those social workers out there, keep up the good work.